eastern shore is sinking, but the water still rises. Global warming, climate change, rising sea level. These buzzwords have been said for decades. There are campaigns and calls to action wanting to change our way of living every year. Humans neglect what gives life and return nothing but pollution. In order to get a better grasp on what causes sea level rise, we talked to professors at Salisbury University who are experts in geography
so we've
and
got
GIS.
these four things. You've got sea level rise through global warming, thermal expansion, isostatic rebound, or also known as subsidence, so we're sinking, and then you've got this North Atlantic gyre. All of that is concentrated right here within the Chesapeake Bay region, and then you add to the fact that we're just the geomorphology of our peninsula is that we're low-lying anyway, and so you've got a sort of recipe for sort of ground zero for sea level rise.
While erosion certainly is an issue, it doesn't explain all of the measurements and the quantitative evidence that we have from sensors in the bay, from sensors in the Atlantic Ocean that uniformly show an increase in sea level rise. In the last 800,000 years, we've never had carbon dioxide at the level we have now. You have to go back somewhere in the neighborhood of like 1, 2, 3 million years ago to find carbon dioxide at the level we have in the atmosphere right now. And certainly they didn't add it near as quickly as we just did it. It's pretty impressive. If you want to use that term, I mean, we killed some fossil fuels. I mean, we turned them out in really quickly. And if you look at the geologic scale, we made these changes very rapidly, and that's what's most concerning. And it's why we feel so confident that humans did this.
What they begin to track now, though, is the extent of the glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, the ice that's not yet in the water. And so that's what they've seen some shrinkage on, and that's what's contributing to some of the sea level rise.
Back in, I think it was 2012, for the first time ever that we know of, the entire Greenland ice sheet was melting. If the entire Greenland ice sheet melts completely, for example, it adds about 30 feet to the global sea level.
Everyone knows that climate change is melting ice caps and warming the sea, but it also brings indirect effects you might not notice.
Economics, agriculture, human health impacts, all of these sort of are indirect effects of that initial warming.
Think about the seafood industry has a definite impact. Certainly tourism industry, right, when you've got entire towns. Just where people are going to live, right? We're going to have a housing crisis. Much of the housing that is going to be inundated is not great housing to start with, so it's actually a low-income housing problem.
2017 was the most devastating hurricane season on record. This is largely due to rapid sea temperature rise. Tropical storms cause storm surge, which is when ocean water is pushed onto the coast. Rising sea levels only worsen this.
As sea surface temperatures increase, you start to put more moisture in the atmosphere, and that gives the atmosphere more fuel, really, more energy, and that energy can manifest itself in more intense precipitation, increased flooding. That's giving more fuel to hurricanes to allow them to intensify more rapidly. Even things like nor'easter frequency, is that something that we're going to see increase in the future? Certainly it's pertinent this year as we've seen a really one of the worst nor'easter seasons on record in terms of the numbers we've had and the intensity. But we can say with pretty high levels of certainty that when a storm does form in the future, it's going to have more energy available to it.
Now, scientists are looking to the future in order to see what trends are telling us. 2100 is the year scientists are using to scale climate change and sea level rise.
We have a lot of population, dense population along our coast. A small change of even a foot of sea level is going to have a big impact.
We predict that by 2100, we're going to see about 5.5 feet of water more within the Chesapeake Bay. Now that would be truly disastrous. That puts communities, when you look at places like Crisfield, Maryland, or Smith Island, or Annapolis, or these sort of places that are low-lying and aren't more than about 4 or 5 feet above sea level to start with, obviously they're going to see some significant inundation if that comes to pass.
It's been my experience, not just in Dorchester, but Smith Island, Tangier Island, Virginia. I'm pretty certain that those places will not be habitable by 2100.
If we could flip a switch today and stop climate change and sort of this global warming, we still have several years of ice melt to catch up with where we currently are. And so we've sort of stored up so much energy that that's going to be a big issue moving forward, even if we were able to fix things pretty rapidly.
Tangier Island, Smith Island, and Hoopersville can potentially be the first refugees of sea level rise.
When we think about the U.S., when we think about climate change, some people kind of talk about the Chesapeake Bay region and Delmarva as ground zero potentially for climate change. We're so vulnerable out here to sea level rise, both on the bay side and the Atlantic side, and that's why I think it's a really important issue locally, as well as sort of a global problem.
To prevent what the trends say about the projected sea level rise of 2100, we must watch our carbon footprint. Salisbury University are doing their part by taking economic risks to make a difference, and others can pick up the slack where it is needed.
We pay extra, but it ends up earning us in the long run, right? So we, to build buildings that are particularly energy efficient, right? They're called LEED certified buildings. And so, the new academic commons got the green roof on the top, right? The living roof on the top. Again, we purchase offsets. We require a certain percentage of our power that we purchase has to be from renewable sources. We pay a little extra for that, but it helps, that piece of the economy. All kinds of sort of different pieces, parts, right? Trying to reduce our carbon footprint. And it's little tiny actions like that, if taken globally, does indeed make a difference. The trouble is that, your ability to impact your own individual situation is just very small, right? Everybody collectively doing that makes a big difference, but everybody's got to chip in. So a lot of it you can see around campus, right? The big solar canopy. We've just got these spin bikes. That was a big thing. Try and reduce our footprint.
If we can get it, K through 12, getting students thinking about climate change at that young of age when they're very impressionable, before politics really play a dominant role in the way you think, I think that is actually one of the vehicles where we can make a lot of change, is really in that K through 12 education piece.
An often occurrence when living in a low-lying community is nuisance flooding. That is flooding that leads to many civic inconveniences, such as road closures, and can be more than a nuisance at times.
We've seen an increase in nuisance flooding events, something like a 200% increase in the last 10 to 15 years.
When I lived on Smith, I remember there was a period where we had water in the streets for like 6 or 7 days. Wasn't any big storm, it was just abnormally high tides. And let me tell you, that was nuisance flooding, but when you have to either get your feet wet or put boots on every damn time you go out of the house for a week, it gets to be nuisances. You wouldn't say nuisance, you'd say I'm out of here if that went on for a month. So nuisance flooding, yeah, it's not catastrophic, it's not devastating, but when you get to pretty regular nuisance flooding, you're not going to live there.
If you can't get from place to place because roads are flooded, that impacts, getting kids to school and getting people to work and, all this.
Saltwater can inhabit many different types of life, but when it comes to life above sea level, it's quite a different story. Due to the salinity of the ocean, many landscape features such as trees, shrubbery, and anything that makes a landscape unique is killed.
The Delmarva Peninsula is seeing increased flooding already. We're seeing water in places we've never seen it before.
And so you see, familiar landscapes changing, forests that I used to, when I was a kid, almost get lost in, that are now what they call ghost forests, just a bunch of snags with, marsh and phragmites coming up under the dead trees. Places that I used to kayak down a winding stream, and now it's a big lake. It's not exactly hardship in that I haven't been able to make a living, but it's a lot of loss of familiar landscapes and much more rapidly than you're used to dealing with. So when you lose the resources, meaning the forest and the marsh and the land, you lose community. You know, I mean, as modern and technological as we are, we're still based on natural resources, you know, and when they start to go in an area, then the communities start to go.
In a place like Aztec, they're not losing beaches because they're letting the island naturally migrate over time with sea level rise, so the beach maintains itself. But on an island like at Ocean City, however, you have these condos that are kind of permanent structures, and the island wants to move, and you don't want to move the structures. Well, the beach is going to get lost as a result. So that's the real issue, right? Ultimately, the beaches would be fine if they were left all by themselves. Naturally, they would just respond to sea level change and the way the natural system does, and they'd maintain themselves. So we're the ones screwing that process up.
The impact of climate change is not only on the land itself, but those who inhabit it. People have made their livelihood here. It's a hard subject for those affected, but it's time to search for solutions.
While there are some local issues there with kind of how the beaches are structured, etc., kind of the overriding theme here is that the sea level has risen there in the last 30 or 40 years. And so now water, again, is able to get into places it didn't used to. And so scared them away. And that's the story we hear a lot from all up and down the southeast U.S. And that discussion's coming soon, I think, to the Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast as well. The Mid-Atlantic and the Northeast are actually sinking. And as we sink and we're sinking and the sea level's going the opposite way, these impacts over the next 30 or 40 years locally are going to be, unfortunately, pretty catastrophic to the beachfront communities in a lot of cases, especially when we bring in a hurricane or a strong nor'easter or something like that. You probably see pretty catastrophic damage.
In low-lying coastal communities, nobody should now be building right along the ground, right? You want to make sure that you're up in the air a little bit so that you can let flood waters pass through. We're working on changing local laws that take sea level rise into account when you're doing new development or when you're turning over old development. So
People living in these areas, they like these areas a lot, and they want to stay there. But even if they know maybe they can't, or maybe their kids are never going to stay there, but they'd kind of like to live out their lives. Nobody wants to pull up stakes and move. I mean, I had a woman say that she said, you asked me about, you talk about the land sinking. She said, my family's been here for generations. That's just too depressing. I'm not going to think about it. I'm not going to talk about it. And I can understand that. So it shows you kind of where people are coming from and what you're dealing with, and why you can't just send them a brochure saying the seas are rising, you need to take action.
it's critical. Yeah. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, it has a lot to do with your identity, right, as a people. And the Chesapeake Bay and the Atlantic Ocean is very much embedded in sort of what Maryland is.
2100 may seem pretty far away, but in order to save these communities from being underwater, we need to start acting now.
I am of the opinion that in the Mid-Atlantic, we're in the sweet spot right now. So we are in a place where people can begin to clearly see this is happening on the landscape. But it's not so
Earth does
dire
not need us
that
here,
it is going to be
us
very
humans.
expensive or very difficult.
But we
to
need
fix.
Earth.
Now is the time. Adapting to the environment is what makes humans human, right? That's what separates us from a lot of the other animals in the animal kingdom, is our ability to manipulate our environment, right? So that's not the issue. We can do it, but it becomes very expensive, becomes very disruptive, where you have entire communities that have to be bought out, right, and moved, this sort of thing. If we make adjustments now, we can begin to reduce that vulnerability, and it's not nearly as expensive and not nearly as disruptive. We probably have about 20 more years that's the case, and then after that, things start to get a little crazy.
Facts and anecdotes only mean so much. Meet Kathleen. She lives with the effects of climate change every day. It's in her backyard. She lives in Hoopersville, which is projected to be underwater within the next decade.
I'm Kathy Blake. I do nothing. No, I'm semi-retired. I'm raising my 5-year-old granddaughter, and we've been on Hoopersville for 23 years. September will be 24. I mean, it was just a better way of life, we thought. And it's been a good life. I will not argue that. It's been very nice here. We've met some wonderful people. We've learned a lot about ourselves as far as how much we're willing to tolerate without snapping. But I'm at the point I can't stand it. And my husband, he's at the point he can't stand it anymore. We're tired of watching everything that we've worked and paid for just get washed away every time we get a high tide. So, and that's what it comes down to. Day to day, I watch the tides, especially when it's raining. If we're getting a wind out of the south, that seems to push the water up in our yard. So, you have to constantly monitor things because with nature, everything changes constantly. I've lost cars. I've lost everything on my first floor. I've lost bicycles, lots of kids' toys, flamingos. I had flamingos outside, and I have to go recover them when they float away. So, just anything that's outside has the potential to float. The creek behind our house, when we bought our house, you could bring a big workboat up the creek all the way up here. We had a pier out there, a little one. And you could bring a workboat up. You can no longer do that. The creek, from all of the erosion, it's just filled in with mud. And during high tide, you might have 6 inches max of actual water in the creek. It looks a lot deeper because it's mostly mud underneath it. And if you walk out on it, you just sink right into it. Oh, it's beautiful land, but you really can't do anything with it. You can't plant any vegetables, flowers. We've planted flowers and beautiful bushes. We spent about $3,000 on beautiful bushes and shrubs, flowers, trees. And the first high tide we got after we did that, they were all gone. And I've tried to plant tomatoes and corn and all that good stuff, but even on platforms, it gets it by the tide. So my cars, I've lost 6 cars in about 15 years due to high tides coming into my yard. When the tide is coming up, we park them across the road up against that garage over there. While the water will still reach over there, it only goes maybe about 2 or 3 inches compared to feet in my yard. Isabel was a scary thing. We didn't take it too seriously at first until at that time, my 5-year-old daughter came home from school, and she said that the people from FEMA had come into the school and they did an assembly on hurricane safety. And she came home. It was our 5-year-old daughter that convinced us that we needed to leave. And, I'm glad we did. I'm glad we did, because we could replace stuff, but we couldn't replace our kids or ourselves. But the morning that Isabel started moving up the coast, that's when we decided we were leaving. The police came and told us, y'all should really leave. When we came home, my husband and we borrowed a boat from some people he knew, and we came home by boat to check on our house. And when we got here, we couldn't even get in the house because all the furniture had floated in front of the doors. So our son was with us. I busted a window and put him in through the window so he could move a couch so we could get inside. So we lost all the meat in our freezer, everything that was in our refrigerator, our washer, our dryer, all of our appliances. And it was just, we lost everything on the first floor. And it was horrible. All of my pictures of my kids, birth certificates, just anything that mattered. I didn't even have pictures of my kids when they were babies anymore. So after that, I started calling every family member I could find and asking them, if you have any pictures of my kids when they were little, please send them to me. And I got several, but there's some I can never replace. So Isabel, changed my whole attitude about living here. I have absolutely no emotional attachment to anything now. when I started getting brave and putting pictures back out of my kids and my grandkids, I put them in frames. They're not mounted on walls. That way, if they say you need to evacuate, I can throw those pictures in boxes and run out the door with them, because the water can take it all, but don't take the pictures of my kids. Honestly, if it happens again, I'm not coming back. I don't care if they pay us with our insurance or not. I'm done. I will not share my house with the water ever again. When the tide does come up, it'll surround the entire house. If you look, everything's on pallets. It's a mess because we're constantly picking things up that are floating and just throwing them wherever. But everything's on pallets. That one I think is 4 or 5 pallets over there. And that's all you can do to try to protect everything. You can see where my yard is just like washing into the ditch. And it's like really annoying because I'm being taxed on it. My yard, it used to come out right to about here. And it's just like being eaten away there. So eventually, if they don't do something, it's going to start eating where the road is, and we're going to be losing hunks of road as well. So it's all exciting. When we first moved down here, high tides have always been high tides, but they've gotten progressively worse for the people who live at this end of the island, because these ditches are just filling up. And it's, you know, it's all across the road all the time when you get high tide now. Super high tides. Like right now we have regular high tide, and you can see over in my yard here, the water's starting to fill in over there. And this is just regular high tide. So it's just slowly eating away at my yard. And then when the tide does come up, lots of debris comes up out of the bay. Stuff that people have thrown overboard will wash up into my yard. We found all kinds of stuff out here. This used to be the living room. And in here we had over 5 foot of water, which would have been over my head. And these windows that we had here were very small. We had just like 2 little windows. But the water had gone up over the windowsill of that. And of course the sewage came up and onto the floor, so we had to gut everything in here as well. So back in the day when Isabel hit, this was my bedroom. And there was a wall here with a door there. And it was about up to here. I seem to remember, yeah, it was right up to about there the water line was. So up to about over my waist. And my bed was underwater. I didn't even have a bed to sleep in anymore. So it's pretty pathetic, but that's the way it goes. And then it got very deep in here. So people who say that the global warming and the sea level rise doesn't exist, they don't live on Hoper's Island. And that's what it comes down to. It's very real. I live it every day.